Hey guys, tonight we tiptoe into the rather hushed, lace-draped, and occasionally tear-stained world of Victorian England, specifically focusing on a curious offshoot of their famous sentimentality, the pet cemetery. Imagine gaslight flickering on a tiny, lovingly inscribed headstone, half hidden by ivy, dedicated to Pip, a most faithful friend, while somewhere nearby a steam train chuffs its mournful way through the foggy London night. This isn't your typical tale of grand empires or heroic battles. It's about Pekingese dogs with elaborate mourning rituals and the very human need to remember even the smallest of companions. Honestly, with the sheer level of public grief some Victorians displayed for their departed parrots, you probably wouldn't survive the emotional intensity or the dry sherry served at the wake. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love to see where you're all tuning in from tonight. So drop your city or country and the local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a dimly lit Victorian drawing room, the air thick with the scent of beeswax polish, coal smoke from the grate, and perhaps a hint of potpourri struggling to overcome the underlying aroma of damp wool and city smog. Outside, the relentless clatter of horse-drawn omnibuses on cobbled streets provides a constant, muffled rhythm to life. Inside, however, is a world increasingly focused on the domestic, the personal, the sentimental. And nestled right at the heart of this domestic sphere, often literally on a velvet cushion by the fire, is the increasingly adored Victorian pet. This isn't just about a cat keeping mice from the larder or a dog guarding the back door anymore. No, oh no. You're witnessing a profound shift, a veritable surge in the keeping of animals not for their utility, but for their companionship, their perceived innocence, and their unwavering, uncomplicated affection in a world that was often anything but. Much of this burgeoning affection for household pets can be traced, as so many Victorian trends can, to the very top. Queen Victoria herself was a devoted animal lover, a mainstream historical fact that echoed through every level of society. Her succession of beloved dogs, from Dash, the King Charles Spaniel who was her childhood companion, to her numerous Skye Terriers, Dachshunds, and Collies later in life, were not just background figures, they were members of the royal household, painted by esteemed artists. Their births, lives, and eventual deaths often noted with genuine sorrow by the Queen and, by extension, her loyal subjects. When the Queen champions lapdogs, an entire nation suddenly discovers an urgent need for a fluffy companion to grace its hearths. This royal seal of approval made pet ownership not just acceptable but fashionable, a mark of refined sensibility and a properly sentimental heart. You can almost picture the society pages of the era if they'd had quite the same snappy format as today, breathlessly reporting on Her Majesty's latest canine acquisition, sparking a rush on breeders of that particular type. And so, as the 19th century progresses, you observe this wave of pet enthusiasm rippling outwards from Buckingham Palace and the grand country estates into the rapidly expanding homes of the burgeoning middle class. With industrialization came increased prosperity for some, and with that prosperity came larger houses, more leisure time, and a desire to emulate the lifestyles of the aristocracy. A pug, a Pomeranian, or a fluffy Persian cat became as much a symbol of middle-class respectability and aspiration as a well-stocked library or a slightly out-of-tune pianoforte. You see families proudly posing for formal portraits with their furry or feathered friends held prominently. Little Fluffy wasn't just a pet. She was an indicator of status, of a household that could afford not just the necessities, but also the gentle luxury of keeping a creature purely for pleasure and companionship. The range of creatures welcomed into these Victorian homes is quite astonishing. Dogs, of course, are paramount, from the aforementioned lapdogs, like the King Charles Spaniel, so popular it almost became a caricature of the era, to terriers full of pluck and personality, and larger breeds kept by those with more space. Cats, while sometimes still viewed with a lingering medieval suspicion, by the more rustic segments of the population. Find their paws firmly under the tables of many urban homes, valued for their quiet grace and independent air. Birds are incredibly popular too. Canaries trilling in ornate cages, parrots and cockatoos preening on stands, sometimes knowing far too many of the family's intimate secrets, which could make afternoon tea with the vicar a rather nerve-wracking affair. One quirky and often problematic aspect of this pet-keeping craze was the fad for exotic animals. Suddenly, much it wasn't enough to have a spaniel, one needed a monkey in a tiny velvet jacket, or a marmoset, or some brightly plumed tropical bird whose natural habitat was 1,000 leagues and a world of climate away from a drafty London drawing room. Many of these poor creatures, acquired at great expense, lived short, bewildered lives, their unique needs little understood, though their passing was often no less mourned. For Victorian women, often confined by societal expectations to the domestic sphere, pets offered a unique outlet for affection and a sense of purpose. A lapdog could be a constant companion, a confidant, a recipient of the elaborate needlepoint cushions and tiny knitted coats that Victorian ladies excelled at producing. Children, too, formed intense bonds with their animal companions, seeing in them loyal playmates and silent sharers of secrets in a world where adult interactions were often stiff and formal. Historians still argue whether this intense emotional investment in pets during the Victorian era was a genuine precursor to our modern understanding of the human-animal bond, a true recognition of animal sentience and individuality, or if it was primarily a form of displaced affection, a safe outlet for emotions in a society that prized restraint, and a way of signaling one's own sensitivity and moral refinement. Perhaps it was a complex mixture of all these things, a tapestry woven from genuine love, societal pressure, and the simple human need for connection. This devotion wasn't just an internal, private affair, it manifested in tangible ways. You see bespoke collars of tooled leather and shining brass, elaborate feeding dishes, even miniature four-poster beds for the truly pampered pooch. Some of these dogs, you'd swear, had more extensive and expensive wardrobes than many of the human inhabitants of the city. Pet shops proliferated, selling not just animals but all the fashionable accoutrements. Photographers offered special rates for pet portraits, often capturing a creature's likeness with a solemnity usually reserved for esteemed public figures. This wasn't just pet ownership, it was pet culture, in full, sentimental, and sometimes slightly baffling bloom. And it is against this backdrop of deeply felt attachment and elaborate care in life that the equally curious and sentimental developments surrounding their death must be understood. This deep affection you're witnessing, this elevation of Fluffy and Fido to treasured members of the Victorian household, inevitably leads to a profound and poignant challenge. For all the satin cushions, the silver-topped walking canes with dog head handles, and the tiny hand-stitched coats, these beloved creatures are, alas, mortal. And so, you find yourself transitioning from the drawing room, filled with the cheerful yaps of a pampered terrier or the melodic trill of a caged canary, to a much quieter, more somber scene. The air grows heavy, not with the scent of coal smoke and beeswax, but with the almost palpable weight of impending loss. You are about to face the heartbreaking, and then intensely practical, dilemma of a cherished Victorian pet's demise. Imagine a dimly lit nursery or a quiet corner of the morning room. Gaslight casts long, sorrowful shadows. A small, furry body lies upon a soft shawl or a child's outgrown blanket. Perhaps it's a King Charles Spaniel. Its once bright eyes now clouded, its breathing shallow. A family has gathered the mother, her face etched with a quiet sadness, dabbing her eyes with a lace-trimmed handkerchief. The children, unnaturally still and wide-eyed, struggling to comprehend what is happening to their playmate. The father stands a little apart, his expression stoic but his gaze fixed on the failing creature. This is Fido's final breath, or perhaps it has just been drawn, leaving an unnerving stillness in its wake. You can almost hear the thud of a tiny tail for the very last time, a faint gesture of enduring affection, or at least that's how the more sentimental members of the family will later recount it. The grief in the room is genuine, a quiet, personal sorrow that transcends social standing. This small animal was not just property, it was a confidant, a source of uncritical love, a warm presence in the often rigidly structured Victorian home. Its loss creates a sudden, aching void. Children, especially, might be experiencing their first brush with the stark reality of death, a confusing and frightening lesson wrapped in the loss of a beloved friend. Remember, veterinary medicine in the 19th century, a mainstream historical fact, was still in its relative infancy. While there were horse doctors and some who attended to livestock, specialized small animal care was scarce and often ineffective. Common canine ailments like distemper, or the snuffles in cats, or any number of mysterious avian declines were frequently fatal. There were no miracle antibiotics, no advanced surgical procedures for Tittles the tabby. The family would have likely exhausted the few available options, perhaps a visit from a local man known for his way with animals, or the administration of dubious home remedies, a spoonful of brandy, a concoction of herbs, or some patent medicine advertised in the penny dreadfuls with bold, unsubstantiated claims. Sometimes these ministrations might have made the poor creature feel a bit perkier, perhaps feigning recovery just to get a bit more of that illicit brandy. But ultimately, nature often took its inexorable course. In these final moments, or in the immediate aftermath, the human desire to find meaning and connection often led to some rather touching, if perhaps anthropomorphic, interpretations of the pet's behavior. It's a quirky but recurring tidbit in Victorian memoirs and letters, the assertion that dear, dying Fido looked up with an almost human understanding in his eyes, or that Polly the parrot uttered a faint, poignant goodbye, Mama before her tiny head drooped for the last time. These attributions of near-human sentiment at the point of death provided a sliver of comfort, a narrative that framed the loss not just as the cessation of a biological life, but as the departure of a feeling, understanding soul. The pet's dignified silence, once punctuated by happy barks or meows, was now absolute, and the house felt emptier for it. Once the initial wave of tears has subsided, and the children have perhaps been gently ushered away after awkwardly trying to explain that Spot has gone to a special farm for dogs, where he can chase squirrels forever. No, you can't visit. A new and intensely practical problem asserts itself. What on earth does one do with the small, still body? This is the heartbreaking dilemma compounded by a very real, and often rather unpleasant, logistical challenge, especially for families living in increasingly crowded towns and cities. There's no convenient back garden for a quiet burial in many a London terrace house. The beautifully tended public parks certainly wouldn't welcome clandestine interments. Historians still argue whether the elaborate mourning for pets witnessed in some Victorian circles represented a genuine societal evolution towards greater empathy and a recognition of animals as individuals deserving of grief, or if it was more an extension of the era's broader, highly stylized, and often performative mourning culture, with pets simply becoming another acceptable focus for the public display of refined sentimentality. Regardless of the deeper societal interpretations, for the family in this dimly lit room, the immediate issue is pressing. The small body, growing cool, cannot remain on the nursery floor indefinitely. The emotional weight of their loss is now compounded by the physical weight of their beloved companion, a tangible reminder that a solution must be found. This pressing, often unspoken question of what next is the very seed from which the curious phenomenon of the Victorian pet cemetery would begin to sprout, offering a new, more dignified, and far more sentimental answer than had previously been available. The era of simply tossing a deceased pet onto the dust heap or into the river was, for a growing number of Victorians, becoming unthinkable. That small, still body, once a vibrant source of joy and companionship, now presents your Victorian family with an urgent, uncomfortable question. A question that hangs heavy in the sorrowful air of the room. The tears have been shed. The initial shock has passed, but little Tiddles or brave Captain the Terrier, who once, allegedly, faced down a runaway hat, cannot remain on the hearthrug indefinitely. You ponder, with a growing sense of unease. The grim and often unhygienic disposal methods that were the common lot for deceased pets in this era. Long before the quaint notion of a dedicated pet cemetery offered a more palatable alternative. For a society so enamored with its living pets, its treatment of their remains often presented a stark, almost brutal contradiction. If you are a denizen of bustling, overcrowded London, or any of the rapidly industrializing cities of Victorian Britain, your options are depressingly limited. The romantic ideal of a quiet burial under a favorite rose bush in the back garden simply isn't available to the vast majority who dwell in terraced houses with tiny paved yards, or in rented rooms with no private outdoor space at all. Public parks, those carefully manicured green lungs of the city, are out of the question. A park keeper would take a very dim view of you digging mysterious small holes amongst his prize petunias, and you might find yourself trying to explain your actions to a rather unsympathetic constable. Trying to find a discreet spot without looking like you're engaged in something far more nefarious than grieving a hamster would be a masterclass in subterfuge. So, what were the prevailing methods? For many, sadly, the deceased pet became just another piece of household refuse, wrapped perhaps in a piece of old sacking or discarded newspaper. The small body might be consigned to the household dustbin to be collected by the dustmen on their regular rounds. These dust collectors, a mainstream historical fact of Victorian urban life, were responsible for clearing the mountains of refuse generated by the city, and animal carcasses were often part of that unpleasant burden. Imagine the ignominy your beloved Pip, who once dined on chopped liver from a special dish, now jostling for space with potato peelings and coal ash in the municipal cart, a truly unexclusive final chariot. It's a jarring thought, and one that must have caused many a sensitive Victorian heart a sharp pang of guilt, even if there seemed no other choice. Another common, if equally unsavory, option was the river. The mighty Thames for Londoners, or the local canal or waterway in other towns, became the final resting place for countless unnamed animals. A quick, weighted bundle dropped from a bridge under the cover of darkness. And the problem was, quite literally, washed away. Out of sight, out of mind. Perhaps. But the reality was that these waterways were already heavily polluted with industrial effluent and human waste. Adding decomposing animal remains did little for public health or the aesthetic appeal of what some ironically termed pet paradise. The river, alas, was more of a general repository for anything and everything the city wished to forget. For larger animals, or sometimes even for smaller ones if the owner knew where to go or couldn't face the dustbin option, there was the knacker's yard. This was a place on the outskirts of town where old, worn-out horses and other livestock were taken to be slaughtered and processed for their hides. Bones, and meat often for pet food, in a rather grim cycle of life. While primarily for agricultural animals, the knacker was sometimes the last resort for a deceased dog or cat. The atmosphere of such a place, the smells, the sounds, the sheer utilitarian grimness of it, would have been profoundly distressing for anyone bringing a cherished companion. It was the very antithesis of the sentimental bond they had shared in life. These disposal methods weren't just an emotional burden, they were an increasing public health concern. Victorian cities were grappling with issues of sanitation, cholera outbreaks, and the miasma theory of disease, piles of refuse and decomposing organic matter, including animal carcasses left in alleyways or on wasteland, were rightly seen as breeding grounds for vermin and disease. While the grand engineering projects of the era were focused on sewers and clean water for humans, the less glamorous issue of animal disposal was a persistent, if often overlooked, part of the urban environmental challenge. Yet, even amidst these grim realities, you see flickers of that enduring human need to do something more. Perhaps a quirky local bylaw in one borough specified that a deceased cat must be wrapped in no fewer than 3 layers of Hessian sacking before being presented to the dustman. A tiny, almost absurd nod towards a modicum of decorum. More poignantly, you might hear whispers of certain unofficial burial spots, a forgotten corner of a common, a secluded patch of railway embankment, or a quiet stretch of riverbank further upstream. Here, under cover of fading light, a grieving owner might hastily dig a small grave, perhaps marking it with a carefully chosen smooth stone or a wilting wildflower picked nearby, a fragile, transient memorial destined to be quickly overgrown or washed away. These were small acts of defiance against the indifference of the city, desperate attempts to find a measure of peace and respect for a lost friend. Historians still argue whether the gradual societal shift towards more formalized and sentimental pet burials was driven primarily by this burgeoning emotional attachment and a genuine desire for psychological closure on the part of pet owners. Or if it was equally, if not more significantly, influenced by these growing middle-class concerns about public hygiene, civic order, and the general desire for a more civilized and aesthetically controlled urban environment. It was likely a complex interplay of both. The loving pet owner, faced with the stark choice between the dustman's cart and the polluted river, must have yearned for a better way, a place where little Scamp or Fluffy could rest with some semblance of the dignity they held in life. This deep-seated dissatisfaction with the unmarked, unceremonious grave laid the fertile ground for the emergence of a new, rather curious Victorian institution. That deep, unspoken yearning for a more dignified farewell. That quiet dissatisfaction with the grim choices of the dustbin or the murky river begins to find an unexpected, almost accidental answer. You find yourself shifting your gaze from the general miasma of urban pet disposal to a specific, rather unassuming corner of London's Grand Hyde Park. Here, amidst the fashionable promenades and sprawling green spaces frequented by nannies with perambulators and gentlemen on horseback, something quite unique, quite unprecedented, is about to take root. You are about to witness the informal, then gradually more formal, birth of what many consider to be the world's first public pet cemetery. A pioneering solution born not of grand design, but of simple compassion. Your attention is drawn to Victoria Lodge, one of the gatehouses on the park's perimeter. It's a modest but respectable dwelling, home to the park gatekeeper, a Mr. Winbridge. He has a small garden adjoining the lodge, a little patch of cultivated ground, wrested from the vastness of the park, perhaps containing a few hardy shrubs, some seasonal flowers, and the usual accoutrements of a working man's garden. It's an unlikely setting for the start of a societal shift. But history, as you know, often chooses the most unassuming stages for its quiet revolutions. Mr. Winbridge, you observe, is a man of routine, responsible for the opening and closing of the park gates, a familiar, if unremarkable, figure to those who regularly pass his way. He's probably seen his share of life's little dramas unfold at the park's edge, but he's about to become an unwitting participant in a new kind of narrative. The most widely accepted mainstream historical fact pins the origin of the Hyde Park Pet Cemetery to a specific, poignant event around the year 1881. The story goes that a Maltese terrier named Cherry, a beloved companion to friends of Mr. Winbridge, some accounts say it was the children of a regular park visitor, Mr. Arthur J. Coke, passed away, faced with the usual unpleasant dilemma of what to do with Cherry's remains. And knowing of Mr. Winbridge's small, somewhat secluded garden, a heartfelt request was made might little Cherry be laid to rest there. Perhaps it was the tearful pleas of the owners, or perhaps Mr. Winbridge himself was a quiet animal lover. Whatever the precise motivation, he agreed. A small grave was dug, and Cherry was interred in the gatekeeper's garden, a simple act of kindness that would have unforeseen consequences. Mr. Winbridge, in that moment, became an accidental pioneer, the first, albeit unofficial, pet undertaker of Hyde Park. Word of this compassionate act, as such things sometimes do in close-knit circles, or among those who share a common passion in this case, doting pet ownership, began to spread. Another grieving owner, perhaps a friend of Cherry's family, or someone who frequented that particular park entrance and knew of the gatekeeper's accommodating nature, heard the tale. They too approached Mr. Winbridge with a similar sorrowful request for their own departed Fido or Fluffy. And again, permission was granted. A second small mound appeared in the garden. Then a third. You can imagine these early encounters' hushed conversations at the lodge door. The presentation of a small, blanket-wrapped burden. The gatekeeper's sympathetic nod. It wasn't a business, not yet. It was a kindness extended, a quiet understanding between fellow animal lovers. In these very early days, before any semblance of formality, the password to this exclusive little resting place might have simply been a tearful inquiry about finding a quiet corner for a faithful little friend. The first grave markers, if any, would have been touchingly simple. A quirky tidbit to consider is that these wouldn't have been the elaborate, carved headstones that came later. Perhaps it was just a smooth pebble from the Serpentine, a child's hand-painted wooden peg with a name crudely lettered, or a small, carefully selected wildflower planted on the fresh earth. Maybe some owners pressed a favorite collar tag into the soil. These were intensely personal, almost secret, memorials in what was still, essentially, a private garden being used for an extraordinary purpose. The squirrels of Hyde Park, you can't help but think, must have been utterly bewildered by these strange new additions to their foraging grounds. Tiny mounds that smelled of humans and sorrow. Gradually, as more requests came, Mr. Winbridge's role evolved from that of a kind-hearted gatekeeper to something more akin to a custodian of this nascent burial ground. The little plot in his garden began to fill, row by tiny row. Historians still argue whether the initial burials in the gatekeeper's garden at Hyde Park were a purely spontaneous cascade of kindness and convenient happenstance, or if there was already a significant, unspoken, and latent demand among a certain class of London pet owners for precisely such a facility, which Mr. Winbridge, through his compassionate nature and uniquely positioned garden, simply happened to be the first to unwittingly facilitate. Either way, this quiet corner of Hyde Park, shielded from the public gaze by the lodge and its surrounding greenery, was becoming something special. It was a place where grief could be acknowledged, where a beloved pet could be laid to rest with a degree of dignity that the city's dustbins and waterways so cruelly denied. The appeal was undeniable. It offered a sense of peace, a connection to the beloved park where the pet might have enjoyed many happy walks, and, most importantly, a permanent, respected resting place. It was a far cry from the furtive, hurried burials some might have attempted elsewhere, or the soul-crushing finality of the refuse cart. Knowing that your cherished companion was in a safe, cared-for spot, even if marked by the simplest of tributes, brought a measure of comfort that was previously unattainable for many urban Victorians. This accidental cemetery, born of one small dog and one kind man, was quietly beginning to meet a profound, unvoiced need. That initial act of kindness in Mr. Winbridge's garden, the burial of little Cherry, has now, as you observe, blossomed into something more. The single grave has become a dozen, then dozens more. No longer a haphazard collection of sorrowful mounds, but a space beginning to show the first tender shoots of deliberate design. You are no longer just in a gatekeeper's back patch. You are exploring what is subtly transforming into a garden of remembrance, a quiet, almost hallowed ground dedicated to the memory of these departed companions. The transition is gradual, born of necessity and the cumulative efforts of grieving owners and a perhaps increasingly invested custodian. As the number of tiny inhabitants grows, you notice a certain order asserting itself. The graves, though small, are often arranged in neat rows, much like their human counterparts, albeit on a Lilliputian scale. Simple paths, perhaps just trodden earth or a scattering of fine gravel, begin to weave between them, allowing access for visitors without disturbing the sacred spots. Maybe a low wicker fence or carefully clipped hedge now demarcates this special enclosure from the rest of the lodge garden, creating a sense of seclusion, a sanctuary set apart from the everyday bustle of Hyde Park. It's as if the Victorian, now with their innate love for order and domestic management, couldn't help but bring a sense of cultivated tidiness, even to this most unusual of final resting places. You might even find a rustic wooden bench tucked into a corner, a place for quiet contemplation or a discreet sniffle into a cambric handkerchief. The planting, too, becomes more considered. This isn't just about digging a hole, it's about creating an environment, a living memorial. The Victorian era, you'll recall, was a time of intense horticultural passion, and the language of flowers was a well-understood vernacular of sentiment. It's a mainstream historical fact that specific plants carried deep symbolic meanings, especially in the context of remembrance and mourning, and these sensibilities undoubtedly found their way into these nascent pet cemeteries. You see clumps of forget-me-nots, their tiny blue eyes a poignant plea, nestled beside a small headstone. Trailing ivy, symbolizing eternity and fidelity, might be encouraged to gently embrace another. Perhaps there are tufts of rosemary for remembrance, or small, somber boxwood shrubs clipped into neat little mounds. If space and ambition allowed, a miniature weeping willow might even make an appearance, its drooping branches the very picture of gentle sorrow. The gatekeeper, Mr. Winbridge, likely found himself adding amateur landscape architect for the dearly departed Small to his list of duties, perhaps with some gentle guidance or specific requests from the bereaved. You can almost imagine the hushed discussions. Do you think Fido would have liked pansies for thoughts, or perhaps lilies of the valley for the return of happiness, however distant that may seem now? And then there are the more personal horticultural tributes, a quirky and rather touching aspect of these gardens. You might observe a patch of particularly vibrant catnip flourishing on one tiny grave, a clear indication of the occupant's earthly delights? Or perhaps a miniature rose bush, if the pet was named Rosie or was particularly fond of sniffing the blooms in the household garden. Some devoted owners, in their efforts to personalize these small plots, might attempt to cultivate their pet's favorite greenery, leading to some rather unique and perhaps challenging gardening experiments. Trying to maintain a patch of especially choice clover for a dearly departed rabbit, amidst London's soot and less than ideal soil, would have been an act of true devotion. The competition for the most melancholic and artfully arranged pansy patch could get surprisingly intense, you'd imagine, if only in the silent thoughts of the visitors. Mr. Winbridge, or whoever found themselves the custodian of such a place, would have had their work cut out for them. Beyond the initial sorrowful task of interment, there's the ongoing maintenance weeding these tiny plots, watering the tender new plantings, ensuring the little paths remain clear. It's a labor of love, or at least a labor of profound respect. He's no longer just a gatekeeper, he's the keeper of countless small memories, the tender of a garden saturated with quiet grief and enduring affection. You might jest he'd unofficially added horticultural therapist for the bereaved to his already varied job description. One can picture him, after his official duties at the park gates are done, spending a quiet hour with a watering can or a pair of shears, ensuring this unique little corner of Hyde Park remains a fitting testament to the bonds it commemorates. The overall atmosphere strived for, and often achieved, in these gardens of remembrance is one of profound peace and tranquility, shielded from the noisy thoroughfares, softened by foliage, and imbued with the quiet dignity of remembrance. They become havens. Historians still argue whether the careful landscaping and planting in these early pet cemeteries were primarily intended to directly mimic the formal layouts and symbolic horticulture of human burial grounds, thereby consciously elevating the status of the interred pets to something approaching human consideration, or if they were more a natural, almost intuitive, extension of Victorian domestic gardening passions, with owners simply creating personalized, Sentimental garden plots as they would for any cherished memory or beloved individual. Perhaps it was a delicate fusion of both impulses. What is clear is that these spaces become more than just gardens, more than just burial grounds. They transform into hallowed spaces, imbued with the deep emotional resonance of love and loss. For the Victorian lady who has lost her lapdog, or the child mourning their first kitten. This carefully tended garden, with its whispering leaves and its tiny, flower-strewn graves, offers a solace that the grim alternatives could never provide. Even the weeds here, you might sardonically observe, probably try to grow with a certain subdued respectability, aware they're in a better class of cemetery. These are not just plots of earth, they are tangible expressions of enduring love. Carefully cultivated gardens where memory itself is encouraged to bloom. The carefully tended flower beds and the whispering leaves of the ivy in these gardens of remembrance certainly create an atmosphere of tranquil sorrow. But it's when you draw closer, when you begin to examine the individual markers nestled amongst the forget-me-nots and miniature roses, that the true depth of Victorian sentimentality towards their departed pets really comes into focus. You are now amidst the tiny tombstones, each one a carefully chosen, lovingly inscribed testament to a life, however small, that was deeply cherished. These epitaphs in stone are where the silent grief of the owners found its most enduring, and often surprisingly eloquent, voice. You kneel, perhaps on a slightly damp patch of grass, to get a better look at one of these miniature monuments. They vary considerably in material and craftsmanship, reflecting both the means and the intensity of feeling of the bereaved. Many are simple, upright slabs of slate, a common and relatively inexpensive stone that lent itself well to clear, incised lettering. Others might be made of sandstone, softer and more prone to weathering, its honeyed tones perhaps seeming gentler, more appropriate for a beloved creature. As the fashion for pet cemeteries grew, and for those with deeper pockets, you might even see small, polished marble markers, their white surfaces stark against the green foliage, sometimes carved with a touch more professional flourish. The scale is, of course, uniformly diminutive. These are headstones for beings that often measured their lives in inches rather than feet. Their final resting places correspondingly modest in dimension, yet often immense in emotional weight. The craftsmanship ranges from the touchingly amateur to the surprisingly skilled. Some of the earliest markers might have been little more than a smoothed river stone, with a name and perhaps a date scratched into the surface with a nail. A heartfelt but rudimentary effort. Later, or for those who could afford it, the services of a local stonemason, more accustomed perhaps to carving memorials for human parishioners in the local churchyard, might be engaged. These professionals would have approached the task with the same tools and techniques, carefully V-cutting the letters, perhaps adding a simple decorative border or a small symbolic flourish. You can almost picture the slightly bemused stonemason setting aside his work on a grand monument for a deceased alderman to painstakingly carve Tiny Tim, a faithful friend, onto a piece of slate no bigger than a schoolchild's primer. But it's the inscriptions themselves, the epitaphs, that truly open a window into the Victorian heart. The mainstream historical fact is that these sentiments often closely mirrored those found in human cemeteries, emphasizing love, loss, and the virtues of the deceased. Names, of course, are prominent: Spot, Flossie, Prince, Cherry, the pioneering Maltese, no doubt. Fido, a name so common it practically became a generic term for dog. Dates of birth and death are often meticulously recorded, lending an air of formal biography to these short lives. And then the terms of endearment, repeated like a gentle litany across the rows: our darling wee rabbi, my beloved Ponto, to the memory of my sweet kitty, a true and faithful companion. The grief is palpable, etched into the stone as surely as the letters themselves. Some of these epitaphs are so directly heartfelt, so unadorned in their sorrow, they could make even the most stoic Victorian gentleman discreetly reach for his handkerchief, perhaps when he thought no one was looking. Beyond the simple declarations of love and loss, You find more elaborate tributes, short. Sentimental verses were particularly popular. Sometimes these were original compositions, heartfelt if occasionally a little clumsy in their rhyme and meter. Other times, lines from popular poems or even adapted biblical passages might be used, attributing a spiritual significance to the departed pet. You might find lines like, "Sleep on, dear Topsy, free from pain, until we meet again," or "Too good for earth," by Angels Taken. It was all part of an attempt to articulate an often overwhelming sense of bereavement. The pressure to come up with a suitably poignant and original verse for, say, Patch the Hamster, beloved of little Emily, must have occupied many a sorrowful evening in Victorian households. A particularly quirky and revealing aspect is when owners commissioned exceptionally long or detailed epitaphs, almost miniature eulogies carved in stone. These might recount the pet's endearing habits, its special tricks, its unwavering loyalty, or a particularly heroic or comically mundane anecdote from its life. While actual grave goods, in the archaeological sense, were unlikely to be detailed on the stone, the sheer effort and expense of such a lengthy inscription speaks volumes about the desire to preserve the pet's unique personality for posterity. You can almost imagine an owner dictating to a patient stonemason, "And please add a line about how he always knew when I was feeling melancholy, and would rest his dear head upon my knee." Of course, the epitaphs probably didn't mention the time dear Fido chewed the new drawing room curtains or borrowed a string of sausages from the pantry, focusing instead on the more beatific aspects of his character. The act of choosing the stone, composing the epitaph, and seeing it installed was a crucial part of the mourning process for these Victorians. It was a way of making the pet's life and its loss tangible and publicly acknowledged. Historians still argue whether the language used in Victorian pet epitaphs, often echoing human funerary sentiments and sometimes even hinting at a reunion in the afterlife, truly reflected a widespread, deeply held belief in an animal hereafter, or if it was primarily a culturally sanctioned way for owners to process their own profound grief and publicly validate the depth of their emotional attachment, using the accepted idioms and rituals of human mourning. Perhaps it was simply that the love felt was so strong. The owners instinctively reached for the most profound language they knew to express it. As you move slowly from one tiny marker to the next, tracing the weathered letters with a fingertip, you realize these are more than just stones. They are silent storytellers, each one a miniature chapter in the larger narrative of human-animal companionship. They speak of devotion given and received, of simple joys and profound sorrows, all condensed into a few carefully chosen words on a small piece of enduring rock, nestled in a quiet garden of remembrance. As you continue your quiet perambulation through these gardens of remembrance, deciphering the heartfelt, sometimes a little over the top, epitaphs etched in stone, your curiosity naturally shifts from the words themselves to the small beings they commemorate. Having absorbed the catalog of names, the Pips, Flossies, and Captains, you now begin to appreciate the sheer breadth of the animal kingdom represented beneath your feet. This isn't just a resting place for the occasional beloved dog or cat. It's a surprisingly motley menagerie, a silent assembly of creatures great and small, common and exotic, each one having clearly captured a Victorian heart comprehensively enough to warrant this final, tender tribute. You might almost need a zookeeper's guidebook to identify all the potential former residents. Naturally, the dogs and cats form the majority of the interred, their familiar forms and established roles as household companions, making them the most frequent recipients of such devoted mourning. You see stones dedicated to every conceivable type of canine tiny, beribboned Yorkshire Terriers, whose main occupation in life was to look decorative on a silk cushion, stout-hearted Bull Terriers, perhaps the beloved guardians of a Victorian nursery, sleek greyhounds, retired from the chase, and a veritable legion of indeterminate terriers, simply labeled Scamp or Pat. Their mixed heritage no barrier to the depth of affection they inspired. Similarly, feline residents range from elegant, aloof Persians, their plume-like tails now still, to common or garden tabbies, whose mousing days are over but whose purrs evidently echoed long in the memory of their human families. The sheer variety within just these two species speaks to the broad appeal of pet ownership across different tastes and perhaps different strata of society that could access these nascent cemeteries. But then your eye catches inscriptions that hint at a more feathered congregation. Birds. You recall from your earlier observations of Victorian homes that were exceedingly popular. Ornate cages housing canaries, whose cheerful song once filled a gaslit parlor, were a common sight. So it's no surprise to find tiny markers for Dickie or Sweetie Bird, their epitaphs sometimes lamenting the silence left by their stilled voices. More elaborate still are the memorials for parrots and cockatoos. These intelligent, long-lived birds often became significant personalities within a household, known for their mimicry and sometimes startlingly astute comments. You might see a stone for Polly, a saucy companion for 20 years, and can't help but chuckle, wondering if Polly's tombstone should have come with a disclaimer. Knew too many family secrets, now taking them all to the grave. Even more humble members of the avian world might be found here. A particularly cherished pigeon, perhaps? Or even a child's pet bantam hen that had a name and a distinct personality. Venturing further, you encounter evidence of smaller nor furrier companions. Rabbits, often the pets of children, have their share of tiny plots. Bunny, beloved of little Ada. One simple stone might read, while guinea pigs were not yet the ubiquitous children's pets they would later become. A particularly doted upon specimen might certainly have found its way here. Perhaps even a white mouse or a favored dormouse, kept in a little wooden box by a lonely governess, could earn a tiny, almost hidden marker. The Victorians, in their burgeoning sentimentality, were clearly capable of forming deep attachments to creatures of all shapes and sizes. It is, however, the presence of the truly exotic and unexpected that underscores the curious case of these cemeteries. Sprinkled amongst the dogs, cats, and canaries, you find evidence of a more adventurous Gilded Age pet keeping. Mainstream historical fact tells us that the Victorian era saw a boom in the importation of exotic animals, as exploration and empire brought creatures from distant lands to British shores, while many ended up in public zoological gardens. A surprising number found their way into private homes as status symbols or objects of fascination. And when these novelties succumbed, as they often did, to the unfamiliar climate or improper care, their heartbroken or perhaps merely disappointed owners sometimes sought to memorialize them here. Thus, you might stumble upon a small, weathered stone inscribed Jocko, a faithful monkey from Afric's shores, or Miss Jenny, a child of the tropics. Referring to a marmoset, were they buried with their tiny velvet jackets and miniature top hats? One can only speculate with a gentle smile, and you might even find a memorial to a tortoise. Old Methuselah, slow and steady, whose long, uneventful life in the scullery garden was nevertheless deemed worthy of this final honor. The quirky or fringe tidbit here is that this desire to personify sometimes extended to rather grandiloquent titles on the headstones. It wasn't unheard of to find a dog referred to as Carlo, a perfect gentleman, or a cat eulogized as Lady Pussington of tender heart. This wasn't necessarily a joke. It reflected the owner's genuine perception of their pet's character and their place within the family hierarchy. You might even find a single, slightly larger stone marking the collective resting place of the three linnets, all victims of some tragic cage-related incident, mourned as a group. Historians still argue whether the inclusion of these more exotic or unusual animals in pet cemeteries was a genuine reflection of deep emotional bonds, equivalent to the love felt for a loyal dog or an affectionate cat, or, if it was, in some instances, partly a subtle display of status, a way for the owner to advertise their worldliness and their ability to possess, and then publicly mourn such rare and fascinating novelties. Perhaps the truth, as with so many human motivations, is a complex blend. A monkey might have been acquired as a curiosity, but over months or years, it could still weave its way into the affections of a household, its antics and unique personality making its eventual loss keenly felt. Reading these varied inscriptions for such a motley menagerie, you get a profound sense of the Victorian capacity for attachment that crossed species barriers with surprising ease. Each stone, whether for a common sparrow or a creature from the Amazon, tells a story of a unique connection, a small life that mattered deeply to someone. It underscores the idea that for these Victorians, a pet wasn't just an animal, it was an individual, a personality, a friend whose loss left a genuine void, regardless of its phylum or genus. Having marveled at the surprising diversity of creatures, granted a final dignified resting place within these hallowed grounds, from the most diminutive dormouse to the most exotic marmoset, your attention now shifts to the living, specifically to the grieving owners who, having entrusted their beloved companions to the care of places like Mr. Winbridge's burgeoning garden, did not simply walk away and forget. For many Victorians, the burial was not the end of the relationship, but rather the beginning of a new phase of remembrance, enacted through a series of quiet, often poignant rituals. You now observe these veiled visits and the tender offerings of fresh flowers, witnessing the enduring bonds that even death could not entirely sever. You see them arriving, often on quiet afternoons, when the park is perhaps less crowded, lending a greater sense of privacy to their somber pilgrimage. Typically, it's a lady, dressed in subdued colors, perhaps not the full, crepe-laden regalia of deep mourning reserved for human loss, but certainly attired in a way that speaks of a respectful, sorrowful errand. She might be alone, her face composed but tinged with a lingering sadness, or perhaps accompanied by a child, equally solemn, clutching a small posy of carefully chosen blooms. The mainstream historical fact is that Victorian mourning etiquette for human dead was incredibly elaborate and pervasive, dictating dress, behavior, and the duration of grieving. It's hardly surprising, then, that some of these sensibilities, in a modified and more private form, would extend to the loss of a deeply cherished animal member of the household. You can almost imagine them mentally checking if their attire is sufficiently graveside appropriate, even for poor Fido. Once inside the little cemetery enclosure, their first act is often the tending of the grave itself. You observe a lady in a dark bombazine dress kneeling carefully beside a small stone, her gloved hands gently pulling a few errant weeds that have dared to sprout, or resettling a decorative border of seashells or smooth white pebbles. She might produce a small watering can, filled perhaps from a tap in the gatekeeper's lodge, to refresh the flowers already there or to water a newly planted miniature rose bush. This is more than just tidiness. It's a continuation of care, an echo of the daily grooming and pampering the pet received in life. It's a quiet assertion that even in death, their companion is not neglected. The pets in the afterlife, one might humorously imagine, are probably comparing notes on whose owner brings the most consistently fresh violets or has the neatest plot. Floral tributes are, of course, paramount. You see simple, hand-picked bouquets of garden flowers, pansies for thoughts, forget-me-nots for remembrance, a sprig of rosemary. Sometimes more elaborate arrangements appear small wreaths, or carefully constructed posies tied with a black silk ribbon. On anniversaries, the pet's birthday, perhaps, or the anniversary of its passing, these floral offerings might be particularly abundant. And it's not just flowers. A quirky and rather touching tidbit is the practice of leaving other small tokens of affection. You might see a child's faded wooden toy dog placed carefully beside the headstone of its real-life counterpart, or a small, slightly battered rubber ball, once the object of countless happy games. Occasionally, a particularly devoted owner might even leave a tiny dish with a few of the pet's favorite biscuits, a gesture both heartbreakingly futile and deeply understandable. Some might even pen little notes or poems, tucking them into a weatherproof pouch or under a stone, sharing the latest family news or simply reiterating their enduring love, as if their little friend could somehow still read them. Beyond the physical tending of the grave, there are the more personal private rituals. You observe owners standing or kneeling for long moments in silent contemplation, their heads bowed. Some might murmur softly, speaking to their departed companions as if they were still present, sharing snippets of news from home, recounting a funny thing one of the children said, or simply whispering words of endearment. You might see a child, with the solemn gravity only a child can muster, earnestly explaining to a small granite marker why their new kitten, while nice, Quas could never truly replace good old Captain. It's a way of maintaining connection, of keeping the pet's memory alive and integrated into the ongoing narrative of their lives. Historians still argue whether these elaborate graveside rituals for pets were entirely a private comfort for genuinely heartbroken individuals, a necessary outlet for grief in an era that often encouraged emotional restraint elsewhere, or if they also served a more subtle, perhaps unconscious and public function, subtly signaling the owner's depth of feeling, their refined sensitivity, and consequently their social and moral standing within a society that increasingly valued and, to some extent, performed sentimental expression. Perhaps it's not an either-or. A veiled lady tending a tiny, flower-strewn grave could be both genuinely mourning her darling Fido and quietly reinforcing her image as a woman of tender sensibilities. You might even see a particularly somber-looking pug, led by its owner, appearing to pay its respects at the grave of another pug, a display of canine solidarity, or perhaps just fulfilling a perceived social obligation in the dog world. These veiled visits and floral offerings transform the pet cemetery from a mere burial ground into a living landscape of memory. Each carefully placed blossom, each whispered word, each moment of quiet reflection reaffirms the significance of the lives commemorated there. It's a testament to the Victorian capacity not just for acquiring pets, but for loving them deeply and mourning them with a sincerity that demanded these quiet, enduring rituals of remembrance. As you observe these veiled ladies and solemn children tending the tiny, flower-adorned graves, a quiet but crucial question begins to form in your mind: who actually makes all this possible? Beyond the grieving owners and their poignant rituals, there must be someone on the ground, a practical hand guiding these expressions of sorrow, maintaining these unique little enclaves of remembrance. Your focus now shifts from the mourners to the often overlooked individuals, the true keepers of quiet repose, whose labor and empathy transformed patches of earth into hallowed ground for beloved pets. These are the unsung heroes of the Victorian pet cemetery movement, the quiet facilitators of countless tiny, dignified farewells. At the forefront, of course, stands Mr. Winbridge of Hyde Park, the accidental patriarch of pet cemeteries. You picture him, perhaps initially a bit bewildered by the growing demand on his small lodge garden, gradually accepting his new, unofficial role. He wasn't a trained sexton nor a professional cemetery manager in the human sense. He was a park gatekeeper, whose duties presumably revolved around locks, keys, and perhaps shooing away stray dogs from the formal flower beds, not meticulously arranging final resting places for them. Yet his compassion, or perhaps simply his inability to say no to a genuinely heartbroken pet owner, set a precedent. A mainstream historical fact is that many of these early pet cemeteries, or designated sections for pets, were indeed managed by individuals already employed in similar capacities: park keepers, estate gardeners who might set aside a corner of the grounds, or even, occasionally, sextons of human cemeteries who, for a modest fee, would allocate an unused patch for animal burials. Imagine the evolving duties of such a keeper. Initially, it might just be granting permission and indicating a suitable spot. But as the number of graves increases, more is required. There's the physical labor of digging each small grave, a task perhaps undertaken with a gardener's spade and a degree of solemnity. You can see this keeper, a man like Mr. Winbridge perhaps, ensuring the dimensions are appropriate for little Timmy the Terrier or Scheherazade the Siamese. He might assist the owners with the interment itself, a quiet, steadying presence during a difficult moment. Then there's the ongoing maintenance, keeping the grass trimmed between the tiny headstones, weeding the flower beds planted by the owners, ensuring the paths remain clear and the overall atmosphere one of respectful tidiness. He needs the patience of a saint and the digging skills of a particularly industrious badger. And what of record keeping? In a more formal human cemetery, there would be ledgers, plot numbers, and official registers. Here, in the early days, it was likely far more informal. A quirky but highly plausible tidbit is to imagine this keeper maintaining a personal, handwritten logbook, perhaps an old accounts ledger, repurposed. In it, he might meticulously note down the name of the pet, the date of burial, the owner's name, and maybe even a brief sympathetic comment, "Little Fido, much lamented by Miss Emily," or "Captain, a brave little dog." Such a logbook would become an invaluable, if unofficial, archive of the cemetery's inhabitants, and the keeper himself an oral historian, able to point out specific graves and perhaps recount the story behind them if a visitor inquired. He might recall that poor little Bess was Mrs. Ainsworth's constant companion for 15 years, or that Master George cried for a week when his rabbit, Peter, passed on. What motivated these individuals? Was it purely altruism, a genuine sympathy for the plight of bereaved pet owners and a soft spot for animals themselves? Or was it perhaps a more pragmatic arrangement? Historians still argue whether the individuals who maintained these pet cemeteries did so primarily out of this sense of compassion and a desire to provide a needed service, or if it was often a practical way to supplement what might have been a rather meager income through the small fees and tips that inevitably began to accompany such burials. A few shillings for digging a grave and ensuring its upkeep would have been a welcome addition to a gatekeeper's or gardener's wages. Likely, it was a blend of both. The initial act might have been pure kindness, but as the demand grew, a modest charge for the labor and space would have been understandable, even necessary. They probably weren't getting rich, but it was a service with a certain emotional, if not financial, reward. These keepers occupied a unique, almost liminal space. They were witnesses to raw, unfiltered grief. Day after day, they dealt with people at their most vulnerable, sharing in, or at least respectfully observing, a very private sorrow. They became, in a sense, lay grief counselors for the pet bereaved, offering a sympathetic ear, a comforting word, or simply the quiet dignity of their service. They weren't just digging holes, they were helping people navigate a type of loss that society was only just beginning to formally acknowledge. You can imagine them becoming adept at reading the signs, knowing when to offer a quiet word and when to simply step back and allow the mourners their space. Their own pets, you might just probably had the best plots in the entire cemetery, with elaborate pre-need arrangements personally overseen by the management. These overlooked individuals, the Mr. Winbridges of the world, were the quiet engines that allowed these gardens of remembrance to flourish. Their daily, often uncelebrated, efforts provided the framework upon which so much Victorian sentiment could be expressed. They were the ones who translated the owner's love and grief into tangible reality, transforming a simple patch of ground into a place of profound meaning, one small, carefully tended grave at a time. They were, in their own unassuming way, pioneers in acknowledging the depth of the human-animal bond. The quiet dedication of Mr. Winbridge and his fellow keepers, tending their unique gardens of remembrance, ensured these little plots remained havens of peace for the bereaved. But beyond the sheltering hedges and the sympathetic understanding of fellow mourners, the wider Victorian public was beginning to take notice of this rather curious new trend. And, as with any novel expression of sentiment in an era both deeply emotional and fiercely self-aware, the reactions were decidedly mixed. You now step out from the hushed reverence of the cemetery itself to gauge the sometimes sympathetic, often skeptical, and occasionally downright satirical public discourse surrounding these final resting places for Fido and Fluffy. News of a place like the Hyde Park Pet Cemetery wouldn't have stayed a complete secret for long. Even in an age before instant social media updates on your dog's latest adorable nap, it would have spread through word of mouth, Perhaps a discreet mention in a lady's correspondence, or even a subtly worded advertisement in a specialist pet lover's journal. For many, particularly those who had themselves experienced the profound grief of losing a cherished animal companion, the idea would have been met with immediate understanding and heartfelt approval. Finally, a way to acknowledge that loss with dignity, you can imagine relieved sighs and grateful letters penned to anyone who would listen, championing these little plots as a testament to humane feeling. These individuals would see no absurdity, only a natural and fitting tribute to creatures that had offered so much uncomplicated love. However, for a society that also prided itself on its pragmatism, its stiff upper lip, and its keen eye for anything that smacked of excessive emotionalism or, heaven forbid, eccentricity, the notion of elaborate burials for dogs, cats, and canaries was ripe for commentary. And comment they did. The mainstream historical fact is that Victorian England boasted a vibrant, often bitingly satirical press, with publications like Punch magazine leading the charge in poking fun at the foibles and fancies of the age. The image of a grown man weeping over a dead parrot, or a lady commissioning a miniature marble angel for her departed pug, was simply too tempting a target to ignore. You can almost see the cartoonists sharpening their pencils with glee, conjuring images of solemn canine funeral processions with dogs in tiny top hats, or elaborate tombstones engraved with hilariously overblown eulogies. A Punch cartoon, at its best, could be so devastatingly on point it could practically deflate a poodle's most cherished pretensions from across the drawing room. This satirical gaze wasn't always malicious. Mind you, sometimes it was gentle, even affectionate, merely highlighting a peculiarity of the national character. But it undoubtedly contributed to a perception in some quarters that pet cemeteries were a rather silly, if harmless, indulgence of the well-to-do, particularly of ladies of leisure who perhaps had too much time and sentiment on their hands. The idea of spending good money on a burial plot and a headstone for an animal, when so much human poverty and suffering existed in the very same cities, would have struck some as a clear case of misplaced priorities. You can just hear a bluff, pragmatic Victorian uncle grumbling over his breakfast newspaper. A tombstone for a tabby preposterous. In my day, a cat was for catching mice, and when it died, well, that was that. Occasionally, an instance of particularly extreme or ostentatious pet mourning would fuel this satirical fire. A quirky, though perhaps embellished, tidbit that might have done the rounds in society, gossip columns could involve something like the tale of Mrs. Ponsonby Smythe's funeral for her beloved Fifi, the French bulldog. Imagine hushed whispers detailing miniature velvet-draped catafalques, a choir of other rather bewildered lapdogs belonging to her friends, and perhaps even tiny black armbands distributed to household staff. Whether true or not, such stories solidified the image of pet mourning as a potential slide into the utterly absurd, providing endless fodder for those who found the whole business comical. The satirists, you imagine, must have felt like they were shooting fish in a barrel, or perhaps more aptly, pugs in a particularly over-decorated Victorian parlor. Yet, it wasn't all mockery and skepticism. Alongside the satirical cartoons and the tut-tutting of the overly pragmatic, there were also voices of genuine sympathy and understanding. Letters to the editors of newspapers, articles in ladies' magazines, and even some more thoughtful essays began to explore the nature of the human-animal bond and the validity of the grief experienced upon its severance. These pieces might argue that the love for a pet was a pure and ennobling emotion, and that acknowledging its loss with respect was a sign of a compassionate and civilized society. Historians still argue whether the satirical critiques of Victorian pet cemeteries and their associated rituals primarily reflected a genuine societal discomfort with what was perceived as excessive or fundamentally misplaced sentimentality, bordering on the inappropriate, or if the satire itself was often of a gentler, more observational kind, merely highlighting a quirky but ultimately harmless, and perhaps even rather endearing, expression of the era's complex emotional character. It's a delicate balance. The Victorians were, after all, capable of holding seemingly contradictory views simultaneously, embracing deep sentiment in private while sometimes mocking its public display. For the patrons of these early pet cemeteries, and for the keepers like Mr. Winbridge, navigating this mixed public perception required a degree of discretion. The cemeteries themselves were often tucked away, not brazenly advertised. They remained places of quiet, personal pilgrimage rather than public spectacle. The act of burying a pet with such care was, for the participants, deeply serious and emotionally significant. Regardless of what the columnist in Punch might have to say on the matter, they were, in their own quiet way, making a statement about the value of their animal companions, a statement that resonated deeply with some, even as it amused or baffled others. The mixed chorus of public opinion, the sympathetic nods, the satirical chuckles in the smoky rooms of London's gentlemen's clubs, and the occasional grumble about misplaced sentiment, did not, it turns out, entirely extinguish the rather tender flame ignited in Mr. Winbridge's Hyde Park garden. While the idea of a dedicated resting place for Fido or Tiddles certainly didn't sweep the nation with the fervor of a newfangled dance craze or a patriotic war, you observe that the concept did begin to track a slow, modest course beyond the park gates, like a dandelion seed carried on an uncertain breeze. The notion of the pet cemetery started to find purchase in other quiet corners, both within London and further afield, offering solace to a growing, if still niche, circle of bereaved animal lovers. Within London itself, the Hyde Park Cemetery, with its almost accidental fame, remained the most prominent. However, you might find, if you were to peer into the walled gardens of certain grand townhouses in Bloomsbury or Kensington, or perhaps explore the more extensive grounds of suburban villas in places like Richmond or Hampstead, that similar, though usually more private, arrangements were being made. A wealthy family, devoted to a succession of lapdogs or a particularly eloquent parrot, might designate a quiet, secluded corner of their own property as a family pet burial ground. These would be intensely personal spaces, perhaps known only to the household and their closest acquaintances, their tiny memorials hidden from public view by high brick walls and dense shrubbery. No need to worry about the satirist from Punch if they can't even see your beloved pug's rather ornate, custom-commissioned cherub. Moving beyond the metropolis, into the shires and provincial towns of Victorian England, the idea also found some resonance, particularly on large country estates. Here, the squire or local dignitary, often a keen sportsman with a pack of hounds or a doting father whose children cherished their ponies and rabbits, had the space and autonomy to indulge such sentiments without public scrutiny. You might discover a forgotten little spinney, just beyond the formal gardens of a rambling manor house, where generations of faithful gun dogs, beloved terriers, and perhaps even a child's pony lay at peace beneath weathered stones, their epitaphs often simple and heartfelt, carved by the estate stonemason. These were truly private acts of remembrance, integrated into the rhythm of rural life and death. Getting planning permission for a graveyard for gerbils in a particularly snooty new suburban development, however, might have been a rather more challenging proposition. You'd imagine. The concept wasn't entirely confined to British shores either, though its spread was, as we've noted, modest. A mainstream historical fact is that other Western nations, experiencing similar trends in sentimental pet ownership, also saw the emergence of dedicated animal burial grounds. Perhaps the most famous international counterpart is the Cimetière des chiens et autres animaux domestiques in Asnières-sur-Seine, on the outskirts of Paris, which opened its gates in 1899 just as the Victorian era was drawing to a close. This beautifully situated cemetery, on an island in the Seine, became a fashionable resting place for the pets of Parisian society, and indeed for animals from further afield, boasting some rather grand and artistic monuments. You might also find early stirrings of the idea in the United States, often driven by individual animal lovers or humane societies, though dedicated pet cemeteries there largely became more common in the 20th century. The Victorian era, however, certainly laid the emotional groundwork. Did these other pet cemeteries, bringing up here and there, slavishly copy the Hyde Park model? Not necessarily. Each developed its own character, often reflecting the personality of its founder or the nature of its clientele. A quirky tidbit you might unearth could be the existence of a highly exclusive pet cemetery on a remote Scottish estate, rumored to only accept Skye Terriers of impeccable lineage, with the owner, a stern dowager, personally vetting each application and maintaining a book of noble canine departures bound in tartan silk. Or perhaps a small-town veterinarian, moved by the distress of his clients, might set aside a portion of his own orchard, his rules for burial being simply a heartfelt assurance that the pet was genuinely loved. You can almost imagine a faint, spectral rivalry between these establishments. Our headstones are far more tastefully melancholic than theirs down in Surrey. You know, and our worms are of a much better class. Historians still argue whether the establishment of these subsequent pet cemeteries was primarily a case of direct imitation, with the Hyde Park model being reported in newspapers or discussed in correspondence, thus inspiring others to replicate it, or if similar societal conditions, the rise of sentimental pet ownership, the lack of suitable urban burial options, and a growing discomfort with unceremonious disposal, led to independent parallel developments in different locales, each responding to a local need. It's likely a combination of both. A good idea, once aired, tends to find receptive minds, especially when it addresses a deeply felt emotional need. Yet, it's crucial to remember the scale. This wasn't a rampant franchising of Fido's Final Rest funerary services. Pet cemeteries remained a relatively rare and often private phenomenon throughout the Victorian era. They were not a standard feature of every town, nor was their use universal even among devoted pet owners. For many, the old, less sentimental methods of disposal, however unpalatable, remain the norm due to cost, accessibility, or simply a different set of priorities. But for those who sought them out, these quiet, dedicated grounds, these echoes of Hyde Park's compassionate innovation, offered a profound comfort, a testament to an affection that even the satirists couldn't entirely diminish. The modest, yet discernible, spread of these quiet gardens of remembrance, these little plots of consecrated earth like the one in Hyde Park, signals a deepening societal acceptance of pet grief, at least within certain circles. But as you continue your exploration of this curious Victorian phenomenon, you notice that the desire to mourn and memorialize a cherished animal companion doesn't always end with a simple burial and a heartfelt epitaph. Oh no. Where there is strong sentiment, and particularly where that sentiment is coupled with a bit of disposable income, a marketplace inevitably begins to stir. You now turn your gaze to the niche, sometimes quirky, and occasionally rather unsettling Victorian businesses that began to cater specifically to bereaved pet owners, offering ways to preserve the memory, or even the physical form, of their departed darlings. One of the most striking, and perhaps to our modern sensibilities, slightly macabre, options available was taxidermy. The Victorians, as you know, had a veritable passion for collecting, classifying, and displaying the natural world, and the taxidermist's art was at its zenith. It wasn't just for exotic game trophies or museum specimens. Increasingly, grieving pet owners turned to taxidermists to preserve their beloved Fido or Polly in a semblance of life. You can imagine the hushed, slightly dusty interior of a taxidermist's shop, with its faint aroma of chemicals and drying pelts, where a bereaved lady might inquire, voice thick with emotion, about having her little pug stuffed and mounted, if you please, in his favorite sleeping position on this very velvet cushion. The results, you observe, could vary wildly. Sometimes a skilled artisan could achieve a remarkably lifelike pose, capturing a spark of the animal's former personality. Other times, well, let's just say the finished product might look more perpetually surprised by its own demise than peacefully at rest. It was a gamble, but for some, the thought of having their pet physically present, even in this static, glassy-eyed form, was a comfort. For those who preferred a less three-dimensional memento, Memorial portraiture offered another avenue. This is a mainstream historical fact. Commissioning paintings, or yet with the advent of photography, photographic portraits of pets was already popular during their lifetimes, but this practice readily extended to post-mortem likenesses. An artist might be called to the home to sketch or paint little Mopsy one last time, perhaps posed on her favorite chair, looking as though she were merely asleep. Photographers, too, offered this service, sometimes with rather elaborate studio backdrops. The challenge for the artist or photographer, of course, was to capture not just a physical likeness, but that ineffable soulful expression or noble gaze the owner so cherished. Even if in life the pet's primary expression was one of hopeful anticipation for a dropped piece of toast. These portraits, framed and hung in a place of honor, allowed the pet to remain a visible presence in the household. Then there were the more intimate, wearable tokens of remembrance. Victorian mourning jewelry for human loss was incredibly elaborate, often incorporating locks of hair, miniature portraits, and symbols like weeping willows or broken columns. It was a natural extension to adapt these forms for beloved pets. You see delicate gold lockets designed to hold a curl of soft fur from a King Charles Spaniel, or a tiny painted miniature of a favorite canary on a mother-of-pearl brooch. Perhaps a gentleman might commission a tie pin or a watch fob featuring a tiny enameled likeness of his faithful terrier. These were deeply personal items, allowing the owner to carry a tangible piece of their lost companion with them. You might find it a touch awkward, perhaps to explain the significance of your new brooch featuring a rather stern-looking hamster at the next society tea party. But for the wearer, it was a precious link to a cherished memory. As the demand, however niche, for these services grew, you begin to see the quiet emergence of specialist craftsmen and even discreet advertisements. A quirky tidbit you might unearth in the back pages of a ladies' periodical or a journal for animal fanciers could be a small, tastefully worded notice, Professor Armitage. Artist in taxidermy. Pets preserved with utmost delicacy and lifelike expression. Discretion assured? Or perhaps Mademoiselle Dubois, miniaturist? Cherished companions rendered in watercolor on ivory? Posthumous sittings by arrangement. You might even find whispers of craftsmen who produced miniature velvet-lined coffins for pets, particularly for smaller creatures like birds or lapdogs, adding another layer of human-like funerary ritual to the proceedings. This wasn't exactly a booming industry, you understand, more a collection of cottage enterprises catering to a very specific and deeply sentimental clientele. Historians still argue whether the commercialization of pet mourning in the Victorian era, with its taxidermied terriers and sentimental jewelry, primarily offered genuine comfort and necessary validation to grieving owners by providing tangible mementos and ritualistic outlets for their sorrow, or if it subtly, perhaps even unconsciously, exploited their heightened sentimentality for profit, encouraging increasingly elaborate and potentially expensive forms of remembrance. The truth, as is often the case, probably lies somewhere in the murky middle. A taxidermist or a memorial artist could be both a skilled artisan providing a valued service and a businessman turning a profit from grief. The desire for a lasting memento is a very human one, and these Victorian entrepreneurs, do you think whatever their primary motivation, were certainly tapping into a deep well of emotion. This marketplace of mourning, however small, demonstrates the extent to which pets had become integrated into the emotional fabric of Victorian life. The willingness to spend money, sometimes considerable sums, on preserving their image or form speaks volumes about their perceived value. It wasn't just about a burial plot anymore, it was about actively curating and prolonging the memory of a companion whose paw prints, it seems, had left an indelible mark on the Victorian heart. The desire to keep a part of a beloved pet close, whether through the slightly unsettling stillness of taxidermy or the delicate gleam of a mourning locket, certainly catered to a tangible need for remembrance in Victorian England. But you observe that the Victorians, a people famously in love with language and literature, also turned to the power of words to immortalize their departed animal companions. You now delve into the realm of sentimental poems and heartfelt stories. The literary tributes that flowed from pens both famous and obscure, all dedicated to the memory of some cherished Ponto or Pip poetry. In particular, that most elevated and emotional of art forms for the 19th century reader, became a key vessel for expressing the profound grief felt for these non-human members of the family. It wasn't just amateur scribblers either. Some of the most prominent literary figures of the age lent their considerable talents to eulogizing their pets, a mainstream historical fact that did much to legitimize the depth of these human-animal bonds in the public eye. You can picture Elizabeth Barrett Browning, frail but fiery, penning her tender and insightful sonnets to Flush, my dog, her beloved Cocker Spaniel. Flush wasn't just a pet. He was a companion through illness and confinement, a furry confidant whose loving hazel eyes and gambols were worthy of poetic immortalization. Her lines, full of genuine affection and keen observation, elevated the canine companion to a subject of serious literary regard. Similarly, Matthew Arnold's poignant elegies for his dachshunds, particularly Geist's Grave, captured the quiet dignity of a beloved dog and the aching void left by its passing. These were not mere trifles. They were heartfelt expressions of loss from some of the era's most respected voices. When such luminaries wrote with such evident feeling about their dogs, it gave a certain permission, a certain validation, to everyone else who felt that same pang for their own humbler companions. One does wonder, with a gentle smile, if Flush truly appreciated the intricate sonnet form, or if, like most dogs, he might have secretly preferred an extra biscuit and a good ear scratch. The themes explored in these pet elegies, whether from famous poets or grieving amateurs, tend to tread a common, sorrowful ground. Unwavering loyalty is a near-constant refrain, the dog who never faltered in his devotion, the cat whose quiet companionship was a steady comfort. Innocence is another key theme. The idea that these creatures, unlike flawed humanity, possessed a pure and uncomplicated goodness. The pain of their absence, the sudden silence in the house where once there were happy barks or contented purrs, is described with a raw and often touching sincerity. Sometimes, you find a tentative hope for an animal afterlife, a gentle questioning of whether such faithful souls might find some peaceful pasture beyond. The sheer volume of poetic tributes dedicated to the bestest boy ever, or the most loving little girl who ever chased a string, is quite something to behold, a testament to countless individual bonds. And it is perhaps in the realm of amateur verse that you find the most direct, if not always the most polished, expressions of grief. Those epitaphs we examined earlier, adorning the tiny tombstones in places like Hyde Park, often took the form of short, rhyming couplets or quatrains. Our darling Spot, so good and true, our hearts will always ache for you. Simple, yes, but undeniably heartfelt. Beyond the cemetery, grieving owners would pour out their feelings onto paper in the privacy of their homes. Diaries and letters from the period sometimes contain these spontaneous outpourings, poems written more for solace than for publication. A particularly quirky and charming tidbit is the occasional appearance of small, privately printed booklets or pamphlets of verse, dedicated solely to the memory of one specific, deeply mourned pet, perhaps Songs for Scamp, or Odes to our Algernon the Angora. These slim volumes, printed in small numbers for family and close friends, represent a profound desire to give the pet's memory a lasting, tangible form. You can imagine some of these amateur efforts displayed a great deal more heartfelt enthusiasm than strict adherence to the rules of scansion or rhyme. But their sincerity is rarely in doubt. It wasn't only poetry that engaged with the theme of pet loss. Sentimental prose in the form of short stories in popular magazines or chapters in novels often featured beloved animals whose deaths were treated with considerable pathos. Children's literature of the era played a significant role. Stories like Margaret Marshall Saunders' Beautiful Joe, though published slightly towards the end of our main period, built upon a growing tradition of narratives that encouraged empathy for animals, often by detailing their suffering or their loyalty, making their eventual passing a deeply affecting moment for young readers. These stories help to cultivate a generation that saw animals not as unfeeling brutes, but as individuals capable of inspiring and deserving of deep affection. Historians still argue whether this proliferation of sentimental pet literature in the Victorian era primarily served as a genuine emotional outlet for writers and readers alike, a way to process and share a type of grief that was gaining new legitimacy, or if it also functioned more broadly as a form of social instruction, subtly teaching prevailing norms of kindness towards animals, the importance of humane treatment, and the socially acceptable ways to express grief and memorialize these increasingly valued companions within the evolving framework of the human-animal relationship. It likely served both purposes, reflecting the private heart while also gently shaping the public mind. As you sift through these literary lamentations, from the polished verses of celebrated poets to the humble, sometimes misspelled, inscriptions on a tiny stone, you gain a richer understanding of just how deeply these animals were woven into the emotional tapestry of Victorian life. The words, whether grand or simple, all speak to a fundamental human need to remember, to honor, and to find language for a love that, though offered to a creature of a different species, was no less real or profound. The poems penned for Ponto and the heartfelt inscriptions etched for Pip may endure in old diaries or on weathered stones, but the very gardens of remembrance that house these tributes were themselves subject to the relentless, often unsentimental, and march of time. As you continue your journey through the curious case of Victorian pet cemeteries, you find that the vibrant scenes of veiled ladies leaving fresh flowers and children whispering secrets to tiny graves gradually begin to fade. The lush sentimentality of one era gives way to the harsher realities and shifting priorities of new centuries. You now witness the slow creep of ivy, the gradual decay, and sometimes the outright closure of these once cherished Victorian novelties. Decades begin to pass. The children who mourned their first canary grow into adults, their own lives filled with new joys and sorrows. Perhaps new pets, but the sharp, immediate grief for that little bird in its tiny Hyde Park plot inevitably softens with distance. The ladies who tended the miniature rose bushes on Fido's grave themselves grow old and pass on, their place in the drawing room taken by a new generation whose connection to these specific animal companions is secondhand, a fondly recounted family tale rather than a lived emotional experience. Without the regular visits, the fresh flowers become sparse, the loving tending of individual plots less frequent. The direct, personal link that gave these cemeteries their pulsing emotional heart begins to weaken, and society itself is changing. The Edwardian era, while still possessing its own charms, begins to shrug off some of the more overt, almost theatrical sentimentality of the Victorian age. Then come the cataclysms of the early 20th century, 2 world wars, the Great Depression. These monumental events reshape priorities on a national and personal level. A mainstream historical fact is that the austerity and immense human loss of wartime and the economic hardships that followed naturally pushed concerns like the upkeep of a pet cemetery far down the list of societal or individual importance. There's less spare cash for elaborate stone memorials for animals, less time for melancholic garden visits, when the nation is fighting for survival or struggling to rebuild. The land itself, especially in expanding urban centers, becomes increasingly valuable, and a small, perhaps now rather neglected, patch dedicated to deceased pets might seem like an anachronism, an inefficient use of space to pragmatic town planners or developers. You can almost hear the ghosts of Victorian lapdogs being mildly but firmly inconvenienced as a new arterial road is routed straight through their once sacred patch of municipal parkland. So, you observe nature beginning its gentle, inexorable reclamation. Ivy, that most persistent of mourners, drapes itself over the tiny headstones, its tendrils tracing the fading letters of beloved names. Weeds, no longer diligently plucked by grieving hands, flourish in the once neat flower beds. Paths become overgrown, their gravel scattered, their edges blurred, Fences might sag, gates rust on their hinges. There's a poignant, picturesque melancholy to these scenes of gentle decay. A quirky tidbit you might discover is the story of a specific, once well-known local pet cemetery that became so completely enveloped by surrounding woodland or parkland that it was effectively lost for several decades. Its existence only rediscovered by a curious local historian stumbling upon a half-buried, moss-covered stone peeking through the undergrowth. The ivy, it seems, sometimes had more lasting respect for the dearly departed than later generations of park maintenance crews. For some of these cemeteries, the decline is more formal. The Hyde Park Pet Cemetery, for instance, eventually became full, its limited space unable to accommodate the unending demand. Other but smaller grounds might simply cease to be viable as the original keeper passes away and no successor steps forward with the same dedication or under the same informal arrangement. Strictly no more interments for canaries, cats, or cherished companions of any species, by order of the very serious men with brand new clipboards and development plans. You can imagine a rather stark new sign declaring, much to the chagrin of any remaining sentimentalists. The gates, if there were any, might be locked for good, the space left to the slow tending of time and weather. What was once a novel, even pioneering expression of deep affection, gradually comes to be seen by later generations as a quaint, perhaps slightly eccentric, relic of a bygone era. The intense, often publicly displayed, sentimentality of the Victorians could appear foreign, even a little embarrassing, to their more reserved or modern descendants. The practicalities of urban life in the 20th century, with its emphasis on efficiency and sanitation, often outweighed the Victorian desire for sentimental memorialization in quite the same way. Historians still argue whether the decline of these dedicated Victorian-era pet cemeteries was primarily a result of fundamentally changing social customs and a genuine diminishment in the perceived need for such elaborate public forms of animal mourning, or if it was more significantly driven by practical economic factors, the relentless pressures of modern urban development, and the simple fading of direct personal connections to those specific interred pets. Whatever the precise balance of reasons, you see these once cherished gardens of remembrance slowly slipping into obscurity. The vibrant emotional life they once hosted, the tears, the whispers, the carefully placed flowers, fades into a quiet, historical echo. The stones remain, for a time, tilted and weathered, silent witnesses to a peculiar and heartfelt chapter in the story of human-animal relationships. A chapter that is now, itself, becoming overgrown. The ivy, as you've seen, has indeed crept, and many of the once cherished gates to these Victorian gardens of remembrance have long since closed. Sometimes literally, sometimes just through the slow attrition of time and memory. Yet, even in their decline or obscurity, these unique little plots continue to exert a certain fascination. They are more than just forgotten burial grounds. They are poignant whispers from the past, offering lingering traces of a very particular kind of love and loss, and an emotional resonance that can still be felt today if you pause long enough to listen. You now find yourself reflecting on this curious legacy, on what these faded cemeteries still have to tell us. For some of these sites, the forgetting has not been absolute. The Hyde Park Pet Cemetery, that accidental cradle of the movement, is perhaps the most notable example. While long closed to new burials and not generally accessible to the public like the rest of the park, it remains a known historical landmark. A mainstream historical fact being its occasional opening for guided tours or its visibility from the Bayswater Road. A dense cluster of tiny, weathered headstones huddled together. Local historical societies or animal welfare groups sometimes take an interest in documenting or even helping to preserve the remnants of these places, recognizing their unique cultural value. Archives might yield old photographs of the cemetery in its heyday, or perhaps even a tattered copy of Mr. Winbridge's or his successor's burial log, allowing names and dates to be painstakingly pieced together, giving voice once more to those silent stones. Even where formal preservation is absent, The lingering traces can be powerful. You might stumble upon a reference in an old local guidebook, or find a cluster of suspiciously small, weathered stones in a forgotten corner of a grand estate's overgrown gardens. These fragments, a tilted headstone with a barely legible name, the faint outline of a miniature path, a rusting piece of what might once have been a tiny fence, are like archaeological clues to a forgotten sensibility. They speak of a time when the death of a creature weighing perhaps only a few pounds could warrant a permanent marker, a dedicated piece of earth, and a torrent of human tears. The emotional resonance comes from recognizing the universality of that grief. The names may be quaintly Victorian, Jeb, tiny, Prince, Walama, but the sentiment behind them. The love for a companion animal is timeless. We see our own potential for such attachment reflected in these century-old memorials, even if our modern pets might demand Wi-Fi in their afterlife and organic, gluten-free treats, rather than just a warm hearth and a kind word. These whispers from the past tell us much about Victorian society beyond their love for lapdogs. They highlight the era's complex relationship with death and mourning, its embrace of public sentimentality, and the burgeoning awareness of animals as individuals with personalities and feelings. They also, perhaps, speak to the domestic sphere, particularly the lives of women and children, for whom pets often provided a unique and uncomplicated source of affection in a world that could be highly restrictive. The original influencers, you might just, weren't hawking diet teas. They were Victorian ladies ensuring their pugs were perceived as the epitome of taste and feeling. And the stories, both real and imagined, that cling to these places add another layer to their mystique. A quirky tidbit you might uncover could be local tales of a particular old pet cemetery being haunted, not in a frightening way, but with gentle, almost charming apparitions. Perhaps the spectral outline of a tiny terrier is said to be seen chasing phantom squirrels on moonlit nights, or a faint, contented purring can be heard near a cluster of cat graves. One particularly persistent and entirely unverifiable legend might tell of a famously loyal old hound, buried with much ceremony, whose ghostly bark can still be heard if the mailman dares to approach his section of the old estate too boldly. Even a century later, these are the folk memories, the embellishments of time, that keep the emotional life of these places flickering, however faintly. Sometimes, a descendant of an original owner, armed with a faded map and a family story, might still make an annual pilgrimage to a barely discernible grave, leaving a single specific flower, a quiet continuation of a long-ago love. Historians still argue whether the Victorian pet cemetery phenomenon was a unique, self-contained historical curiosity, a peculiar blip tied specifically to that era's very particular social and emotional climate, or if it represents a crucial early chapter in a continuous and evolving narrative of human efforts to formally acknowledge, ritualize, and find solace for the grief experienced when animal companions die. Looking at the prevalence of modern pet cemeteries, crematoria, and online memorial sites, it's hard not to see a direct lineage. The Victorians, in their own elaborate, sometimes slightly eccentric way, were grappling with a feeling that remains profoundly familiar. The deep, sorrowful pang of losing a creature that was simply family. These whispers from the past, from beneath the ivy and the weathered stones, remind us that while customs change and empires fade, the quiet, unassuming love for a pet, and the equally quiet, unassuming pain of its loss, endures. They are gentle echoes of a time when such feelings first found a small, dedicated piece of earth to call their own. And so, our journey through the quiet lanes and ivy-covered stones of Victorian England's most curious final resting places comes to a gentle close. The stories of Fido and Topsy, of Mr. Winbridge's unexpected calling, and of the sentimental tears shed over tiny graves, now begin to soften, like the gaslight dimming at the end of a long evening. The rustle of silk mourning dresses and the distant clatter of horse-drawn carriages fade into the tranquil quiet of your own approaching rest, Allow yourself to feel the peaceful atmosphere of those almost forgotten gardens of remembrance, not with the sadness of loss, but with the calm appreciation of a time when even the smallest of lives were deemed worthy of such tender, enduring affection. Picture the tiny headstones, weathered by time, now sleeping soundly beneath a blanket of soft moss in the gentle patina of a century past. The strong emotions, the poignant epitaphs, the sometimes quirky expressions of Victorian grief, all mellow into a sense of historical sweetness, a quiet testament to the enduring nature of companionship. There are no more plots to examine, no more satirical cartoons to consider, no more gatekeepers tending their unusual charges. The whispers from that past have delivered their gentle message. The weight of Victorian sentimentality, with all its elaborate customs, can now lift from your shoulders, leaving behind only a sense of peaceful closure. The curious case of the pet cemeteries has been explored, its quiet corners illuminated for a time. Let the image of those serene, slightly melancholic gardens slowly dissolve. Feel the comfortable support beneath you, the gentle weight of your own blanket, the soft rhythm of your own breath in the stillness of your room. The journey is complete. The stories are told. And now, there is only the inviting prospect of deep, untroubled sleep. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.